It was late December, and the snow had blanketed the streets in a pristine white coat. Marcus, a 32-year-old web developer, had decided to spend Christmas alone in his new rental house nestled deep in the quiet outskirts of Maine. It was his first Christmas without his family after a bitter fallout with his siblings. To take his mind off the loneliness, he had stocked up on Christmas decorations, groceries, and a few bottles of wine. The house, an old Victorian-style property, had a rustic charm that Marcus found appealing but also slightly eerie. The day before Christmas Eve, Marcus had spent the evening setting up his Christmas tree. He turned on some festive music, hung lights, and placed ornaments with care. The twinkling lights reflected off the frosted windows, creating a warm, inviting glow in the otherwise desolate landscape. Satisfied with his handiwork, Marcus poured himself a glass of red wine and settled onto the couch to watch a Christmas classic. Just as he was getting comfortable, there was a knock at the door. He froze. The knock was sharp and deliberate, cutting through the silence of the night. Marcus checked the time. It was past 10 p.m. He wasn't expecting anyone, especially not at this hour. Slowly, he rose from the couch and approached the door. Through the peephole, he saw a man standing on the porch. He was dressed in a worn Santa suit, his face partially obscured by the dim light of the porch lamp. "Ho, ho, ho," the man said cheerfully, his voice muffled by the door. "Merry Christmas." Marcus hesitated. Something about the man seemed off. His suit was filthy, the white trim yellowed and the red fabric frayed at the edges. His eyes didn't carry the jolly warmth one might expect from a Santa impersonator. They were sharp and calculating. "Can I help you?" Marcus asked through the door, keeping it firmly locked. "I'm spreading Christmas cheer," the man replied, "giving out gifts to folks in the neighborhood." Marcus frowned. There were no close neighbors, and he hadn't seen anyone delivering anything since he moved in. "I think you've got the wrong house," he said, his tone firm. The man chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "Are you sure? I've got something special for you." Marcus didn't respond. He backed away from the door, heart pounding. The man knocked again, this time harder, the sound reverberating through the quiet house. "I'm not interested. Please leave," Marcus called out, hoping his voice didn't betray his growing unease. The knocking stopped. After a moment of silence, Marcus peeked through the curtains. The man was gone. Feeling a mix of relief and lingering dread, Marcus double-checked the locks and returned to the couch, though his earlier comfort was now replaced by unease. Later that night, Marcus was jolted awake by a noise. He wasn't sure what had startled him, but the house felt different, too quiet, too still. He sat up, straining to hear. Then he noticed it, the soft, rhythmic creak of footsteps coming from upstairs. He hadn't been upstairs since he moved in. Adrenaline surged through him as he realized he wasn't alone. Grabbing his phone, he dialed 911, but his shaky hands accidentally ended the call before it could connect. A new sound made him freeze, a faint jingling, like bells, coming from the staircase. The creaking steps grew louder. Someone, or something, was descending. Marcus grabbed the nearest object, a heavy ceramic vase, and held it like a weapon. He backed into the corner of the living room, his eyes locked on the staircase. A shadow appeared first, stretching long and grotesque in the dim glow of the Christmas tree. Then the figure stepped into view. It was the man in the Santa suit, but his demeanor had changed. His grin was gone, replaced by an expression of cold malice. The jingling came from a set of bells tied to a crude-looking sack slung over his shoulder. The sack seemed to writhe as if something inside it was moving. "You shouldn't have ignored me," the man said, his voice low and threatening. "I came to give you a gift. Get out," Marcus yelled, raising the vase. His voice cracked with fear. "I've called the police." The man laughed, a deep, guttural sound that sent chills down Marcus's spine. "Oh, the police won't make it here in time." Marcus hurled the vase at the man, missing by inches. The Santa lunged forward, and Marcus bolted toward the kitchen. He grabbed a knife from the counter and turned to face his pursuer. But when he looked back, the man was gone. The jingling bells echoed faintly, as if he were moving deeper into the house. Panic consumed Marcus. He darted toward the front door, only to find it locked from the inside. deadbolt engaged. He didn't remember locking it. His trembling hands struggled to turn the bolt, but before he could unlock it, the jingling returned, louder and closer. Marcus spun around and saw the man standing at the end of the hallway. This time, he wasn't alone. Behind him stood a grotesque figure, barely human. It was thin, with unnaturally long limbs, its skin pale and stretched tight over its bones. It had no eyes, only dark, empty sockets that seemed to bore into Marcus's soul. "They're here for you," Santa said, his voice dripping with malice. Marcus screamed and threw the knife. The blade struck the wall, missing both figures. He ran toward the back door, yanking it open and plunging into the icy night. He didn't stop running until he reached the neighbor's house, pounding on the door until someone answered. The neighbors called the police, who arrived within minutes. They searched Marcus's house but found no sign of the man in the Santa suit or the horrifying figure. However, they did find something that made Marcus's blood run cold: the sack. Inside it were photographs of Marcus taken from outside his house, through the windows, while he decorated his tree, and even while he slept. The police assured Marcus they would patrol the area, but the events of that night haunted him long after Christmas had passed. He never found out who the man was or what he truly wanted. All he knew was that he would never spend another Christmas alone. On Christmas Eve, 4 friends, Jeremy, Caitlin, Chris, and Erica, gathered for a long-awaited holiday tradition. A cabin getaway in the remote, snow-covered wilderness of Wisconsin. Jeremy had found the perfect cabin online, boasting old-world charm, a roaring fireplace, and miles of untouched nature. It was isolated enough to provide peace, but close enough to a small town for supplies and festive spirit. When they arrived late in the afternoon, the group was in awe. The cabin sat at the edge of a frozen lake, surrounded by towering pine trees that shimmered under the weight of fresh snow. It was Christmas Eve, and Darren, a college student home for the holidays, was reluctantly pulled into his younger sister's last-minute idea to decorate their old family barn. The barn had been on their family property for generations, sitting at the far end of a snow-dusted field. It hadn't been used for years, its paint peeling and the wooden slats warped from time and weather. Darren had grown up hearing eerie stories about the barn. His grandfather, before he passed, told him and his sister, Lily, tales of lights seen through the boarded-up windows, strange figures spotted lurking around the fields at night, and the unnerving sound of chains rattling from within. But Darren dismissed the stories as nothing more than old myths meant to keep curious kids away from dangerous, decaying structures. This year, Lily decided the barn should be part of their Christmas celebrations. "We'll string up some lights, set up the old sleigh in there, and make it magical," she said, her eyes sparkling with excitement. Darren begrudgingly agreed, though he thought the whole thing was unnecessary. "The barn's a wreck," he had argued. "Why not stick to the house like normal people?" But Lily was insistent, and so, armed with a box of Christmas lights, garlands, and other festive decorations, the two siblings trudged through the knee-deep snow toward the barn. The sky was overcast, casting a gray light over the landscape, and the air was biting cold. When they reached the barn, Darren hesitated before opening the door. He could have sworn he heard a faint noise from inside, like footsteps crunching in the hay. "Probably just a raccoon," he muttered to himself, trying to shake the unease. The barn door creaked loudly as he pushed it open. The inside was dim, the only light coming from the gray sky outside. Dust motes danced in the air, and the smell of old hay and mildew was overwhelming. Lily, undeterred by the gloomy atmosphere, immediately set to work. She began hanging garlands on the support beams while Darren climbed a rickety ladder to hang the lights from the rafters. As he worked, the faint noise returned. This time, it was more distinct, a soft, rhythmic tapping, like someone gently knocking on wood. "Did you hear that?" Darren asked, pausing on the ladder. "Hear what?" Lily replied, not looking up from her task. "That knocking sound." Lily shrugged. "It's an old barn, Darren. It's probably just the wind or something." Darren wasn't so sure, but he didn't want to come across as paranoid. He went back to stringing the lights, but the tapping continued, growing louder and more erratic. When he finally climbed down, he looked around the barn, trying to find the source. The sound seemed to be coming from the loft above. "Stay here," he told Lily, grabbing a flashlight from their supplies. He climbed the ladder cautiously, each rung groaning under his weight. The loft was darker than the rest of the barn, the corners shrouded in shadow. Darren swept the flashlight beam across the space, but saw nothing out of the ordinary, just old hay bales and discarded farm tools. Yet the tapping persisted, now accompanied by a faint whispering that sent chills down his spine. "Who's there?" Darren called out, his voice echoing. The whispering stopped abruptly, replaced by an oppressive silence. Darren's heart raced as he inched forward, his flashlight trembling in his hand. Then, in the farthest corner of the loft, he saw it. A small, weathered box that looked completely out of place amidst the other debris. Darren crouched down and opened the box. Inside was a collection of old photographs and papers. The photos showed a group of children standing in front of the barn, their faces eerily solemn. One child stood apart from the others, his eyes wide and mouth slightly open, as if caught mid-scream. "Darren!" Lily's voice shattered the silence, startling him. He nearly dropped the flashlight as he scrambled to his feet. "What's wrong?" he called back, climbing down the ladder as quickly as he could. Lily was standing by the barn door, her face pale. "Someone's out there," she said, pointing toward the field. Darren followed her gaze. At first, he saw nothing but snow and shadows. Then, near the edge of the tree line, he spotted a figure. It was tall and thin, wrapped in what looked like an old, tattered coat. The figure wasn't moving, just standing there, watching. "Maybe it's a hunter," Darren said, though he didn't believe it. "In this weather? On Christmas Eve?" Lily replied, her voice trembling. The figure suddenly turned and disappeared into the woods. Darren and Lily exchanged a look, both feeling a growing sense of dread. "Let's finish up and get out of here," Darren said, trying to sound calm. They worked quickly, stringing up the remaining lights and setting up the old sleigh. But the feeling of being watched never left. As they packed up their supplies, Darren glanced back toward the tree line. The figure was there again, closer this time. Its head was tilted slightly, as if observing them with curiosity or malice. "We're leaving," Darren said firmly, grabbing Lily's arm. They hurried out of the barn and back toward the house, the snow crunching loudly beneath their boots. That night, Darren couldn't shake the feeling of unease. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying the events of the day in his mind. Then, just as he was about to drift off to sleep, he heard it, the tapping sound, coming from outside his window. He sat up, his heart pounding. Slowly, he pulled back the curtain and froze. The figure was standing in the yard, its hollow eyes staring directly at him. In one skeletal hand, it held a piece of paper. Darren's blood ran cold as he recognized the photograph from the loft, the one with the screaming child. It was late December, just 2 days before Christmas, when Megan's family made the long drive to her grandmother's secluded cabin in the Appalachian Mountains. The cabin was a family tradition, a place to gather during the holidays and reconnect with nature away from the chaos of the city. Megan, now 16, had mixed feelings about the trip. The charm of the cabin had worn off years ago, and the thought of spending a weekend with limited Wi-Fi and no cell service didn't excite her. The drive took longer than expected, and by the time they arrived, it was dark. Snow fell heavily, blanketing the woods in an eerie stillness. The cabin, with its warm glow of light peeking through the windows, looked inviting, but Megan couldn't shake the unsettling vibe that always crept in when they were this far from civilization. As they unpacked, Megan noticed her younger brother, Sam, staring out the window. "What are you looking at?" she asked, setting down a box of groceries. "There's someone in the woods," Sam said, his voice flat. Megan frowned and joined him at the window. The forest stretched endlessly into the darkness, the trees swaying gently in the wind. "I don't see anything," she said. "I saw them," Sam insisted. "They were just standing there." "It's probably a deer or something," Megan said, trying to brush off his comment. But as she turned away, a faint unease settled in her chest. That night, after dinner, the family gathered in the living room to decorate the Christmas tree. Megan's parents laughed and shared stories while Sam and Megan hung ornaments. The warmth of the fire and the twinkling lights on the tree made the cabin feel almost magical, and for a brief moment, Megan let herself relax. But then came the knocking. It was soft at first, almost imperceptible. Megan thought it was just the wind rattling the windows. But when it came again, louder this time, everyone fell silent. "Who could that be?" her dad said, setting down his mug of cocoa. The cabin was miles from the nearest town, and visitors were rare. Her mom frowned. Maybe someone got stranded in the storm? Her dad grabbed a flashlight and opened the front door. The icy wind rushed in, but there was no one there. He shined the flashlight across the yard, illuminating the snow-covered ground. There were no footprints. "Strange," he muttered, closing the door and locking it. The family tried to resume their evening, but the mood had shifted. Megan caught Sam glancing nervously at the windows, and she couldn't blame him. She felt like they were being watched. Later that night, Megan lay in bed, unable to sleep. The knocking had unsettled her more than she wanted to admit. She stared at the ceiling, listening to the wind howling outside. Then she heard it, a faint crunching sound, like footsteps in the snow. She sat up, her heart pounding. The sound was coming from outside her window. Gathering her courage, she crept to the window and peeked out. At first, she saw nothing but darkness. But as her eyes adjusted, she noticed something, or someone, standing at the edge of the forest. It was a figure, tall and motionless, wrapped in what looked like a tattered coat. Its face was obscured by shadow, but Megan could feel its gaze, cold and piercing. She stumbled back from the window, her breath coming in short gasps. When she looked again, the figure was gone. The next morning, Megan tried to convince herself it was just her imagination. But when she saw Sam sitting silently at the breakfast table, staring into his cereal, she knew he'd seen something too. "Did you hear anything last night?" she asked him quietly. Sam nodded. "It was outside my window." "What was?" Sam hesitated. "I don't know. It looked wrong." Megan's stomach twisted. She wanted to tell her parents, but she knew they'd dismiss it. Instead, she decided to keep an eye on Sam and the woods. That afternoon, Megan and Sam were tasked with collecting firewood from the shed behind the cabin. The path to the shed was covered in fresh snow, and the trees loomed overhead like silent sentinels. As they neared the shed, Megan stopped. There, in the snow, were footprints, large and deep, leading away from the shed and toward the forest. She glanced at Sam, who looked just as terrified as she felt. "Let's just grab the wood and go," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. They hurried into the shed, grabbed an armful of logs, and started back toward the cabin. But halfway there, Megan heard it again. The crunch of footsteps, this time behind them. She turned, her eyes scanning the woods. "Run," she whispered, and Sam didn't need to be told twice. They sprinted back to the cabin, dropping the firewood in their haste. Inside, Megan locked the door and pulled the curtains shut. Her parents, startled by their panicked entrance, demanded to know what had happened. "There's someone out there," Megan said, her voice shaking. "We saw footprints." Her dad frowned but grabbed his coat and flashlight. "Stay here," he said. "No, don't go out there," Megan pleaded, but he was already stepping outside. Minutes passed like hours as Megan and Sam waited anxiously. Finally, their dad returned, his expression grim. "There's no one out there," he said. "The footprints just stop." Megan felt a cold dread settle over her. How could footprints just stop? It didn't make sense. That night, the knocking returned. It was louder this time, more insistent. Her dad opened the door again. But once more, no one was there. The snow was untouched. By now, even their parents couldn't deny that something strange was happening. They decided to leave the next morning, cutting the trip short. But that night was far from peaceful. Megan woke to the sound of whispering. It was faint, almost like the wind, but as she strained to listen, she realized it was coming from inside the cabin. She sat up and saw Sam standing at the doorway to her room, his eyes wide with fear. "It's in the living room," he whispered. Megan's heart raced. She grabbed a flashlight and followed him, careful not to make a sound. As they approached the living room, the whispering grew louder. It wasn't one voice but many, overlapping and indistinct. They peered around the corner and froze. The front door was wide open, snow blowing in, and standing in the middle of the room was the figure from the woods. Its head jerked toward them, and for the first time, Megan saw its face, or what was left of it. Its eyes were empty sockets, its mouth twisted into an unnatural grin. "Run!" Megan screamed, grabbing Sam's hand and bolting back to their rooms. They barricaded themselves inside, their breaths ragged and hearts pounding. The whispers grew louder, filling the entire cabin. And then, just as suddenly as it started, everything went silent. When morning came, the figure was gone, and the door was closed. But in the snow outside, a single message was written: "You can't leave."